Hi guys, welcome. Let's answer some Qigong questions. All right, question one. Let's see. From episode 63, from Jikendo Chicago. Hi, Jikendo Chicago. Thanks again for the excellent video. You're very welcome. I was wondering where Gong or Gong fits into the grand scheme of things, especially relating to cases like John Chang, Dynamite Jack in some videos, the mega of Java, Teachings of an Authentic Tao is Immortal, unquote, is an interesting book pertaining to him. Okay, I know you have previously spoken on Gong or Gong, but in the way you said things are cycles with Qigong, moving, standing, sitting, and laying down. Would there then be a point after cultivation to move into Gong, and is Gong the only way to cultivate supernatural aspect, or can be the same be found in Qigong and Tai Chi? Thanks very much for your for your attention and gratitude. You're very welcome. That's a very good question because it's very common. First thing, I want to make sure I get everything. So the first thing is Mr. John Chang that you asked about. I'm not familiar with his work, so I can't comment. I never read the book that you listed here, The Magas of Java, Teachings of an Authentic Tao is Immortal. Never heard of it, and I never read it, but I'll probably look it up later. Sounds interesting. So, sorry, I'm not much help there. I don't know about that master or teacher. Second thing you said is, I know you have previously spoken that Gong, but you have said that things are moving cycles, moving, standing, sitting, laying down. Yeah, they are in the original Taoism, and that's the only one I can speak for. I'm not sure how different lineages approach it. For us, the moving and the standing and the sitting and the laying down are in cycles. So it's not like they're in steps. Like, okay, step one, we do moving. Step two, we do standing. And then we do sitting. And then you're done. You never do it again. It's not like that. It's more like the Tao. It's more like the seasons. If you look at the seasons, you look at fall to winter, winter to spring, spring to summer, and it keeps on rotating. That's just the way the Tao is. Just like our planet's always rotating. Just like our breathing, it's a cycle, right? Everything in Mother Nature is a cycle. Eating, going to the bathroom, sleeping, getting up. Everything's a cycle. So the original Taoist practice is also a cycle. So for moving, we move so we can enter the flow state. We stand so we can charge our body, get a lot of energy. That allow us to do safely prolonged sitting. We sit so we can heal the heart center. And then once we do that, we can merge into the head center, be one with the Tao. And sleeping practice is for, well, the most basic level is to charge your body while you're sleeping so you get better sleep. On a more advanced level, it has a lot to do with the I Ching, which I talked about in previous episode. So that's usually what I tell people when they ask me what these practices are for, and they're really effective for the things I've just said. But it's really a blanket statement. I say that because it's convenient. But in reality, yeah, moving is to enter the flow state so you can stand, sure. But on a deeper level, they actually interject back and forth. For example, when you're standing, most people are familiar with internal power development, where they set a container, holding a ball, hanging the string, opening the spine, opening the pores, rooting into the ground, not moving, stilling the mind, letting the blood go into your belly. And then from there, things start to sprout. And basically, you're a tree. You're rooting up and down, and you start to absorb energy, and you feel a lot of power eventually. So that's the container stage. But in the higher stage, spontaneous movement from the inside out will start to happen. Whether you like it or not. If you're standing long enough, you'll start shaking, and your body will start releasing muscular, tendon, and fascia tension. And if you stand even longer than that, you start releasing tension deeper inside your body. Not too deep, that's more for sitting, but that's inside out. If you stand longer than that, and very few people do, you start getting movements from the outside in. In Christianity, they'll call it the grace of God. In Hinduism, they'll call it Keiya. My Sanskrit sucks. I think I'm probably not pronouncing it right. In Chinese, we call it something, right? So in Buddhism, I don't know what they call it, but every tradition usually has a name for this phenomena. And for those who do psychedelics like DMT or ayahuasca, I don't even have to talk about it because they get it in 5 minutes, right? So this outside in stuff, which is maybe I estimate less than 2% of Qigong people know about it since the Cultural Revolution, when these practices were wiped out. But the older system definitely have it. All of them do. So the outside in kind of spontaneous movement, there's two ways you can approach it. You can either stand so long that once you charge the container, it goes from inside out, and then later from the outside in. Maybe it'll take you 10 years, maybe it'll take you 5 years, depending on the person. Or you can cheat. By doing movement Qigong that we talk about, if you do a certain type of practice, certain lineage, like we practice heavy mountain lineage, that's the one I practice, there are ways to practice in such a way that spontaneous movement from the outside in will happen easily while you're moving, not standing though. But once you get it through moving, which is easy, then you can inject it into standing, and now you don't have to wait 5 years. So that's an example of how they teach each other. So these things are intertwined. They're not a linear ladder of a progression. And same goes with sitting, same goes with the 3 center work, same goes with laying down, which would take me way too long to go into. But laying down, standing, sitting, and moving, like you said, is a cycle. Not just to mirror the Tao in terms of being seasonal, but these things actually allow you to get a certain attribute much easier than the other 3. The 4 pillars, whether you're moving, standing, sitting, or laying down. Some attributes is really easy to get while you're laying down, but extremely hard to get while you're moving. Some attributes is really easy to get while you're sitting, but extremely hard to do when you're standing, and vice versa. So what you do is, you get a certain attribute by using one of the 4 pillars, rather sitting, standing, laying down, and moving. And once you can easily get it, then you throw it on the other 3. Now your learning curve is 3 times faster than to just practice and hoping that it'll happen. For example, let's say you want to go into trance. It's extremely hard to do that while you're moving or standing, because it's so close to deep sleep, REM sleep state, and it's so close to the dream state in the brain waves in your brain. Not many people can enter REM sleep while you're standing, right? But most people can fall asleep easily while they're sitting down. So that's an example of how a certain attribute, in this case trance, is really easy to get while sitting, extremely hard to get in standing. However, once you get it in sitting, now it's easy to throw some parts of it into standing and moving. So that's another example. Besides the spontaneous movement, there's trance. Same thing with Tikkun counsel from the Qi, which is a direct line from the Nei Yi, the oldest scripture in Taoism. Whenever there's no clarity in some questions in your life you want to solve, you want to tap into the intuitive side of your brain. One of the things you can do is ask a question as sincerely as possible, but don't chase the answer, and let your subconscious mind find the answer. This is well documented in hypnosis and psychology, right? So sleeping Qigong is kind of designed for that in one branch of his technique. That's really easy to do while you're laying down, doing laying down Qigong, but it's extremely difficult to do when you're standing. So what you do is you learn it in laying down Qigong, then you throw it into standing, and certain parts of it will get injected. Not the whole thing, of course. I wish. So that's another example. So I just give you 3 examples, whether it's spontaneous movement from outside in, or we're talking about trance and dreamlike states, or we're talking about the more I Ching part of it, where you're trying to tap into the intuitive state of your brain to solve a problem. So that's 3 attributes. And if you notice, they're learned easily by either standing, laying down, moving, or what have you, right? So each one of it uniquely and intrinsically makes it easier for you to get a very particular attribute that you're chasing. Once you get that attribute, you throw it on the other 3. That's the reason why it happens in a cycle. I hope I answered that question. That's why in the original Taoism is not a ladder. It's not a linear structure progression. Like, stage 1, stage 2, stage 3. It's not like martial art, right? White belt, yellow belt, orange belt. It's not a linear progression like academics. It's seasonal for a reason. So you keep on injecting things into each other like a spider web. They start to intertwine, making your learning curve way quicker than if you just practice in a linear way. So that was the original Taoist paradigm for learning, which is circular and spiral instead of a straight line. Much like anything they do, nothing is a straight line in Taoism, right? Okay, so the next part of your question is, would there then be a point after cultivation to move into Neigong or Loigong? And is Neigong the only way to cultivate supernatural aspect found in Qigong and Tai Chi? Well, first of all, I don't know what you mean by supernatural. That is found in Qigong and Tai Chi. And you also reference Loigong. Just talking about Loigong and Qigong, it seems like you're separating these two things. Like they're different, but they're kind of not, because they're just labels. Loigong or Neigong in Chinese, the word nei or loi in Cantonese literally means internal. That's all it means. And gong means practice, work. Literally skill through hard work. So we have qigong, we have mo gong or martial art gong. So everything is gong in Chinese. Everything is practice. Practice, work, right? So it's internal work. That's what the word lo gong means, or nei gong. Qi Gong, qi is a literal word, means air, which is symbolic for the word energy, and gong is work. So Qi Gong can be nicely translated to energy work. Lo Gong can be translated to internal work. So Lo Gong is internal work, Qi Gong is energy work, and you're separating the two as though they're different practices. But they're kind of not. If you look at it from the history of Taoism, for example, in the Zhou and Qin dynasty, Zhou was the third Chinese dynasty. So in the Zhou dynasty, that's where Proto-Taoism was invented. And I say proto because they weren't even called Taoism back then. At that point, everything was effortless or surrender practice, which rather is sitting or standing, and also moving. The moving practice was called Dao Yin, which is still pretty famous nowadays. The sitting practice was called Dou Sut. Dou means the Tao, and Sut means a skill or an art. And then the standing practice, which is still, pretty famous nowadays, is Zham Zhong, the standing practice. Those were the three main practices that archaeology has found evidence for those early dynasties in China. So those things survive into modern history, right? And we still have standing practice, we still have sitting practices, and we still have moving practices. But the moving and standing practices, which is originally the standing was called Zham Zhong, just like it is now. The sitting was called Dou Sut, which is the Taoist skill or Taoist art. And the moving practice was called Dao Yin. Now, these practices still survive to modern time, but they're designed for different purpose. The moving and standing practices is really for your physical center, your physical power. While as the sitting practices is really for emotional healing, or universal consciousness, where you're merging with the Tao, or entering altered state of consciousness. Now, in modern times, during the Cultural Revolution, the spiritual practices for these two centers, which is originally called Dou Sut and also Dao Yin, no, Dao Yin was not, just Dou Sut, was outlawed. It was not, you were not allowed to practice it. If you practice it, you can get in a lot of trouble. You can get jail time, slave labor, in some cases execution. It was a very dark time in history, but they allowed the physical practice, and they rebrand that by inventing a new label, the Communist government, and they call it Qi Gong. That's where that term comes from, right? So if you say Qi Gong and Nei Gong or internal work, which is the Ming Dynasty term, they're really saying the same thing. So you can just call it, all of it, you can call it Lo Gong if you want, internal work, because literally it's all internal work. Some teachers will use a certain label and then give it a certain definition and say you can't step outside of it. Internal work means this, Qigong means that. So they get really hung up on those names. But if you look at the actual history of China, it really doesn't matter. They're constantly inventing new names, a lot of time to escape political punishment, right? But really, if you forget about the labels for a second, you basically got moving practice, standing practice, sitting practice, and laying down practice. And all four of those have at least 500 sects of Taoism lineages. They do not agree on practices. They do not agree on some concepts, They agree on certain concepts, but they're very, very different. So, I hope that answers that question. As for supernatural powers, right? I'm going to take the point of view of our lineage because from a Hinduism point of view, and also Buddhism point of view, and also from my lineage point of view, supernatural power or any form of power chasing is a distraction and is not considered good. Distraction in terms of distraction from the goal. The goal of original Taoism and what I practice and what a lot of people practice that stick to the original premise of Taoism, which is the same as Buddhism and Hinduism and Christian mystics for that matter, is to relieve suffering, to heal, because there's so much hurt and there's so much pain, whether it's physical, spiritual, or emotional. And we want to heal these things, physical, emotional, and spiritual. Physical center, emotional center, and spiritual center. That's what these practices were designed for, rather standing or the sitting practices, and the moving practices that you can interject, and the laying down practices. When you chase power beyond what you need, in this case, supernatural power, in that kind of lineage and tradition and that worldview of relieving suffering becomes a distraction because it is one cause of suffering. The mentality and the greed and the lust for power, if you just look around in society, corrupts because we're human. We have greed, we have ego. We want to push everyone aside so we can win. We want to dominate. These are attributes of power in any form and domain. So when we go past competence and survival and we try to gather way more power than we need, it usually leads to corruption and it usually leads to human suffering. Although some Taoist fire school traditions, not all, some in history and other traditions around the world has definitely fallen into the temptation and the trap of the chasing and greed for power, it never leads to anything but suffering if you really think about it. If you really take the long picture and step back, the Tao is right, the Buddha is right. Power corrupts. So you only gather enough power to help you go back to the main objective, which is to relieve suffering. To give you a brief example, if we do prolonged sitting, it is designed to heal your heart center, repressed memory, childhood trauma, PTSD, anxiety, depression, the list goes on. And we heal this center so eventually we can open up the upper gate in the upper center so we can merge into universal consciousness or the Tao or the Buddha nature or the emptiness or the Brahman, whatever different culture has called different name. And the point of that is to relieve suffering because when you open up these two centers, it's amazing. It's amazing feeling and clarity. But in order to do that, it requires prolonged sitting in our tradition. But prolonged sitting would mess your body up completely. Like a lot of monks break their bodies in China from sitting too long. As modern science has proven, prolonged sitting is bad for you. You need to be physically strong enough to do this. That's what standing practices is for. Standing practice is to gather so much physical power that you can do prolonged sitting without a problem, without falling asleep, without physical pain, without joint pain, and without blood circulation problems, among other things. So that's what the power of standing is for. But so that illustrates the idea that we gather power just to help a primary objective of sitting and healing. It's not power for power's sake. But I gather that from your question, it is the idea of supernatural power now is kind of power for power's sake. And that is very, very damaging for the human psyche because it creates human suffering. And I kind of been there with, like I've been high as a kite and happy my whole adult life because I was obsessed, just obsessed with martial arts, right? And I train 6 days and 4 nights a week. I train. I love pressure testing. I love inventing new drills. I love techniques. I love the strength aspect. I love the power aspect. Nothing was ever enough. No matter how fast I was moving to the point where all my training partners couldn't stop me, I still wanted more speed. No matter how much my joints were hurting and I was breaking my body, I still wanted more power. It didn't matter I have more power than I need at that moment. It didn't matter. I had more speed than I ever need. It didn't matter. Nothing mattered. I just wanted more, 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 more. And you see that in the business world. No matter how much money people have, they want more. And in the end, Taoism is right. It produced an enormous amount of suffering. That's how I eventually almost killed myself and broke down. I overtrained to the point after, at that point, 36 years, that I collapsed. And my central nervous system was shutting down slowly, and my immune system. And for those that follow my work, I talk about this a lot in my book and also in my earlier podcast. So I'm not going to, bore you guys with the same story. But the point is, the lust for power that happened to me, in this case, martial art, was what eventually caused suffering. And it always does. So you want to be careful when you start looking for power. If you practice Qigong, just like if you practice martial arts, power will come as naturally as a byproduct of these practices. But if they become the main objective, the idea of power, it will, most often than not, in the history of these traditions, it will produce suffering. So be very careful. When greed and ego is in a driving seat, it's not good. As Grandmaster Fukin said, this stuff's all for healing. This is medicine. That's what these practices were designed for. If we keep that in mind and we keep our heart in the right place, then we can't go far off. And then when power comes, we can handle it and not misuse it, right? So anyways, that's it for today. Please leave your questions below. For those that want to learn these methods that we're discussing, please follow the link below in the description. One time a week, I teach a live stream class, and we practice the sitting, laying down, moving, all the methods that I talk about in Qigong. And there's also half the class is live Q&A, which gives me a chance to talk to my students and discuss these things about Taoism and Qigong, how to apply it to daily life, how to work with anxiety, depression, and all sorts of problems, right? And all classes are recorded and stored in the student library. So if people miss a live stream class, it's not a problem. They can always watch it anytime they want. And we also have a private student forum, which is the main place we use to make sure every single student get personalized, individualized instruction, which is really, really important in Qigong. Without personalized instruction, this stuff is not 100% safe, right? So anyways, there's more stuff. You can read about it on the website. See you guys next time. Have a good night.